Alana stood in front of her bedroom mirror, brushing her curls into a neat ponytail. Today was a big day. She was finally going to fly in first class for the first time. Her father had surprised her with the ticket the night before, and she had barely been able to sleep from the excitement. She pulled on her favorite hoodie and jeans, simple but comfortable for the long flight. Her sneakers squeaked lightly as she headed downstairs, where her dad was already waiting by the door. He was dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his leather briefcase resting beside him. "You ready, kiddo?" he asked with a smile. "More than ready." Alana grinned, adjusting the straps of her backpack. The drive to the airport was full of laughter. Her father, Mr. Jonathan Roberts, teased her about how she might fall asleep the moment she sat in the plush first-class seat. Alana joked back, saying she'd order every snack on the menu just to make the most of the experience. When they arrived at the airport, the terminal buzzed with energy. Travelers hurried past with luggage and towel, while announcements echoed overhead. Jonathan handed Alana her boarding pass. "You'll board before me today," he said, checking his watch. "I need to take a quick call before we leave, but I'll meet you on the plane." "Got it," Alana replied, clutching her ticket tightly. Jonathan gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before walking toward a quiet corner to make his call. Alana headed toward the security check, her heart racing with a mix of nerves and excitement. As she approached the boarding gate, she glanced down at her ticket again. First class. Seat 2A, she smiled to herself. She couldn't wait to sink into the luxurious seat and experience what it felt like to fly in style. The boarding announcement echoed across the terminal, and Alana joined the line. She noticed the other passengers. Most were dressed in suits, fancy dresses, or elegant outfits. Alana glanced at her hoodie and shrugged. Comfort was more important than looking fancy, she thought. When it was her turn, she handed her boarding pass to the attendant at the gate. The machine beeped, and the attendant smiled. "Have a great flight." "Thank you," Alana replied, stepping onto the jet bridge. She felt like she was walking into a dream. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin gleamed with soft lighting, wide leather seats, and sparkling glass dividers. Alana's eyes lit up as she spotted her seat near the window. Just as she was about to settle in, a stern voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, young lady," said a flight attendant with a stiff expression. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" Alana blinked, startled. Yes, this is my seat. 2A." The flight attendant's eyes narrowed. "Let me see your ticket." Alana hesitated but handed it over, wondering why she was being questioned. This was supposed to be an exciting moment, but something didn't feel right. Alana sat on the edge of her seat, confused and unsure of what to say as the flight attendant, Brenda, inspected her ticket with a frown. Brenda, a woman in her mid-40s with perfectly styled hair and a crisp uniform, looked at Alana and then back at the ticket, her expression skeptical. "This can't be right," Brenda muttered, shaking her head. "First class isn't typically for passengers like this." Alana's heart sank. Passengers like this? What did she mean? Her excitement began to fade, replaced by embarrassment, as she noticed a few curious glances from nearby passengers. "This is my seat," Alana said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "My dad bought the ticket for me." Brenda raised an eyebrow. "Are you traveling alone?" "No, my dad's on this flight too. He's just not boarding yet," Alana explained, hoping this would clear up the misunderstanding. Brenda's expression didn't soften. Instead, she handed the ticket back to Alana and folded her arms. "I'm sorry, but I need to verify this with the gate. You'll need to step aside for now." Alana felt her cheeks flush. "But the ticket says 2A, she insisted, pointing at the clearly printed seat number. Brenda let out a sigh, her tone turning dismissive. "Look, sweetheart, I think you might be confused. It's probably a mistake. First class is reserved for passengers who fit certain standards." Alana bit her lip, trying not to cry. She didn't want to cause a scene, but the humiliation was growing with every second. She glanced around, hoping someone would step in, but most of the passengers avoided her gaze, pretending not to notice. "I'm not confused," Alana said, her voice firmer this time. "This is my seat. I'm not leaving." Brenda gave a tight smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Let me check with another attendant." She gestured for a younger crew member to come over, a man named Derek, who looked unsure of how to handle the situation. "What's going on?" Derek asked, glancing between Brenda and Alana. "This young lady claims her seat is in first class," Brenda said with a small laugh, as if the idea was absurd. "But I think it's a mistake." Derek looked at Alana, then at the ticket she was holding. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the way Brenda was handling things. "The ticket says 2A, he said cautiously. "I don't see a problem." Brenda frowned, clearly unhappy with his response. "It's probably a system error. First-class seats don't just go to anyone." Alana clenched her fists, frustration bubbling inside her. "My dad bought this ticket for me. I belong here." Brenda raised her chin. "I'm sorry, but until we can confirm, you'll need to move to coach." Alana felt a lump in her throat as she stood, clutching her backpack. She didn't want to make things worse, but her dream of a first-class experience was quickly turning into a nightmare. Alana walked down the narrow aisle toward coach, clutching her backpack tightly. She kept her head low, her excitement for the trip now replaced by a heavy feeling of shame. She could still feel the stares of the first-class passengers behind her, some curious, others judgmental. She tried to focus on finding an empty seat in coach. The rows were tighter, and the chatter of passengers was louder here, but at least no one was paying her much attention. Finally, she spotted a seat near the back of the plane and slid into it, sinking down as if she could disappear. Alana pulled out her phone and texted her dad. "Dad, they told me to move to coach. The flight attendant didn't believe I had a first-class ticket. Where are you?" Her dad didn't reply right away. He was still on his business call, and she didn't want to disturb him with another message. She sighed and glanced out the window, trying to hold back tears. This trip was supposed to be special, something she'd remember forever. Now it was turning into one of the worst days she'd ever had. Meanwhile, up in first class, Brenda was walking confidently back to the front of the cabin, satisfied with how she had handled the situation. Derek, the younger attendant, hesitated before following her. "Brenda," he said quietly, "are you sure about what you did? Her ticket did say 2A. Brenda waved him off. "Mistakes happen all the time, Derek. Besides, you saw her, didn't you? She doesn't look like a first-class passenger. I was saving her from embarrassing herself." Derek frowned, but didn't argue further. He wasn't sure how to respond, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. Back in coach, an older woman sitting across the aisle from Alana leaned over. She had kind eyes and a kind voice that cut through the noisy cabin. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked gently. Alana looked up, surprised by the stranger's concern. "I'm okay," she said quietly, though her voice wavered. The woman smiled warmly. "I couldn't help but notice what happened up there. It wasn't fair, what they did to you." Alana felt a little comforted by the woman's words. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said softly. "My dad bought that ticket for me." The woman nodded. "I know, sweetheart. Some people just make judgments without thinking. Don't let it ruin your trip. You've got every right to be here." Alana managed a small smile. "Thank you." As the plane continued boarding, Alana's dad finally texted back. "What do you mean they moved you to coach? Stay put. I'll handle it as soon as I'm on the plane." Alana sat up straighter, her dad's words giving her a glimmer of hope. She didn't know what he would do, but she trusted him completely. For the first time since the confrontation, she began to feel like everything might be okay. Alana's dad, Jonathan, boarded the plane a few minutes later, carrying his briefcase in one hand and his phone in the other. He was still typing an email as he stepped into the first-class cabin, but he paused when he didn't see Alana in her assigned seat. His sharp eyes scanned the rows. but there was no sign of her. Confused, he turned to the nearest flight attendant, who happened to be Brenda. "Excuse me," he said politely. "My daughter was supposed to be in seat 2A. Did she move to another seat?" Brenda's face froze for a moment, but then she put on a professional smile. "Oh, you must be the father. Yes, we had a little mix-up with her ticket, and she's been seated in coach." Jonathan frowned. "A mix-up? What kind of mix-up?" "Well," Brenda began, her voice a little too rehearsed, "there seemed to be some confusion about her seat assignment. We believed it might have been an error in the booking system." Jonathan's expression darkened slightly, though he kept his voice calm. "Her ticket said 2A, didn't it?" Brenda hesitated, the confident tone in her voice faltering. "Well, yes, but—" Jonathan cut her off. "Then why is my daughter in coach?" Brenda struggled to come up with an answer. "Sir, we just wanted to make sure everything was in order. Sometimes passengers don't realize." Jonathan raised a hand to stop her. "Let me make something very clear. My daughter's ticket was for first class. There's no reason she should be anywhere else." By now, a few other passengers were quietly listening, their eyes darting between Jonathan and Brenda. Derek, the younger flight attendant, stepped forward, looking nervous but determined to speak up. "Sir," Derek said, "I checked the ticket myself. It was definitely for seat 2A. I think there's been a misunderstanding." Jonathan nodded at Derek, appreciating his honesty. He turned back to Brenda. "It seems this mix-up was entirely unnecessary. I'd like my daughter back in her seat immediately." Brenda's professional mask cracked. She realized she had underestimated the situation, but she still didn't fully understand who she was dealing with. "Sir, I was only trying to ensure." Jonathan interrupted again, his tone firm but measured. "You don't need to explain. Just bring my daughter back to her rightful seat." Brenda reluctantly nodded and walked toward the coach section, her usual confidence replaced with unease. Meanwhile, Jonathan took a seat in 2A, setting down his briefcase and waiting patiently. When Brenda arrived at Alana's row, she spoke in a forced, polite tone. "Miss, your father would like you to return to first class." Alana looked up, surprised but relieved. She grabbed her backpack and followed Brenda back up the aisle, trying to ignore the stares from other passengers. As Alana sat down beside her dad, he smiled and squeezed her hand. "Don't worry," he said softly. "I've got everything under control." For the first time that day, Alana felt a sense of calm return. Alana settled into her first-class seat next to her father, still feeling a little shaken but comforted by his calm presence. Jonathan noticed the tension in her shoulders and leaned closer. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Alana nodded. "I'm okay now. But—" She hesitated, unsure if she should say more. Finally, she added, "It was really embarrassing, Dad. She acted like I didn't belong here." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. "No one has the right to make you feel that way. Let's make sure this never happens again." As they spoke, Brenda stood near the front of the cabin, nervously glancing over at them. She still hadn't pieced together who Jonathan was, but she could tell he wasn't an ordinary passenger. Her earlier confidence had turned into unease, and she avoided making eye contact with him. After a moment, Jonathan pressed the call button. Brenda hesitated before approaching, smoothing her uniform as she walked over. "Yes, sir. How can I assist you?" she asked, her voice polite but strained. Jonathan looked up at her, his expression calm but firm. "I'd like to have a word about how my daughter was treated." Brenda swallowed hard, already dreading the conversation. "Sir, I assure you, I was just following protocol. There must have been a mistake with her ticket." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Her ticket was perfectly fine. You decided there was a problem because of how she looked." Brenda opened her mouth to respond, but Jonathan continued, his tone steady. "You assumed she didn't belong in first class, and in doing so, you humiliated her." Brenda's face flushed. "Sir, I didn't mean to." Jonathan leaned back in his seat, cutting her off. Do you know who I am? Brenda blinked, unsure how to respond. No, sir. Should I? Jonathan gave her a pointed look. I'm Jonathan Roberts, the CEO of this airline. The words hit Brenda like a thunderclap. Her face turned pale, and she took a small step back. Passengers nearby, who had been listening quietly, now exchanged shocked glances. The air in the cabin felt heavy with tension. Jonathan didn't raise his voice, but every word he spoke carried weight. My daughter is here because I wanted her to experience the best this airline has to offer. Instead, she was made to feel unwelcome. That's unacceptable. Brenda stammered. Mr. Roberts, I didn't realize. That's the problem, Jonathan said firmly. You didn't take the time to consider her as a person. You judged her based on her appearance. Brenda's head dropped, and she murmured, I'm so sorry, sir. It won't happen again. I hope not, Jonathan replied. But I'll make sure this incident is reviewed by the team. We need to ensure no one else has an experience like this. With that, Jonathan dismissed her, and Brenda quickly retreated. Alana looked at her father, her admiration shining through. Thanks, Dad, she said softly. Jonathan smiled. You never let anyone tell you where you do or don't belong, Alana. Remember that. The plane hummed with the low buzz of engines as Brenda retreated to the galley, her hands trembling. She replayed Jonathan's words in her head, realizing the weight of her actions. The other flight attendants avoided making eye contact with her, sensing the tension. Brenda leaned against the counter, trying to gather herself. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, but today she knew she had made a serious mistake. Meanwhile, in first class, Alana leaned back in her seat, finally feeling a sense of peace. She glanced at her dad, who had opened his laptop and was typing an email. What are you doing? She asked curiously. Jonathan looked up and smiled. I'm sending a message to the airline's management team. We need to address this situation and make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Alana nodded slowly, feeling a sense of pride in her father's calm but firm approach. Do you think she'll get in trouble? She asked hesitantly. Jonathan paused. It's not about punishment, Alana. It's about accountability. She needs to understand why what she did was wrong, and the airline needs to ensure its employees are better trained to handle situations like this. As the plane climbed higher, a senior flight attendant named Claire approached Jonathan. She had a warm demeanor and a sense of authority that immediately set her apart. Mr. Roberts, may I have a word? She asked politely. Jonathan nodded, closing his laptop. Of course. Claire knelt slightly to speak at eye level. First of all, I want to sincerely apologize for what happened to your daughter. That is not the level of service we strive for, and I'm deeply sorry for the distress it caused. Jonathan nodded. Thank you, Claire. I appreciate your words. Claire glanced toward the galley where Brenda was standing, then back at Jonathan. I've spoken with Brenda, and she understands the gravity of her actions. I assure you, we'll address this internally and ensure she receives the necessary training. Jonathan studied her for a moment, then said, I trust you'll handle it appropriately. But this isn't just about one person. It's about ensuring every passenger is treated with respect, no matter how they look or what someone assumes about them. Claire nodded, her expression serious. You're absolutely right. We'll make it a priority. After Claire left, Alana felt a wave of relief. She leaned over to her dad and whispered, You handled that so well. Jonathan smiled. Thank you, sweetheart. But remember, this is also about you. You deserve to be treated with dignity, no matter where you are or who you're with. A short while later, Brenda walked back to the first-class cabin, her expression subdued. She approached Alana and Jonathan cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm truly sorry for how I treated you. I wasn't fair, and I hope you can forgive me. Alana hesitated but saw the sincerity in Brenda's eyes. She looked at her dad, who gave her a small nod. I forgive you, Alana said softly. Brenda thanked her and walked away, leaving Alana feeling lighter. Jonathan squeezed her hand, You handled that like a champ, he said proudly. Alana smiled. Maybe this flight would still turn out okay after all. The rest of the flight passed smoothly, with the attendants remaining attentive and polite. Alana settled into her seat, watching the clouds drift past the window. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt comfortable. Her father glanced at her occasionally, offering a reassuring smile that reminded her everything would be fine. When the plane landed, passengers filed off slowly. Alana and her dad stayed seated until most of the crowd had cleared. Jonathan preferred not to rush. "Take your time, kiddo," he said. "No need to rush into the chaos." Alana smiled, appreciating his calm approach. As they stepped into the airport terminal, they noticed a group of airline staff waiting near the gate. A senior manager, dressed in a crisp uniform, approached Jonathan and Alana. His name tag read Mr. Callahan. "Mr. Roberts," Callahan began, his tone respectful, "I understand there was an incident on your flight. First, let me apologize on behalf of the entire airline. We deeply regret any distress caused to you and your daughter." Jonathan nodded. "Thank you. I appreciate you addressing this." Callahan looked at Alana and added, "I'd like to personally apologize to you, Miss. The way you were treated was unacceptable. I assure you, steps will be taken to ensure our staff understands the importance of treating every passenger with respect." Alana nodded, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you. I'm glad you're taking it seriously." Callahan continued, "We will be providing additional training to our crew members to prevent this kind of misunderstanding in the future. If you have any further concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out directly." Jonathan extended a hand. "I appreciate your response. It's important to me that no one else has to go through this." After the conversation, Alana and Jonathan made their way to the baggage claim. Alana, feeling more relaxed, turned to her dad. "Thanks for standing up for me, Dad. I don't think I could have done it on my own." Jonathan smiled. "You should never feel afraid to speak up for yourself, Alana. You have every right to be treated with respect, no matter where you are or what anyone thinks." As they left the airport and stepped outside, the fresh air felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Alana looked up at her dad, grateful for his calm strength and steady presence. She realized that, while the experience had been tough, it had taught her something important. It reminded her that she belonged wherever she chose to be, and that sometimes the most important battles were the ones that taught her to value herself. She tightened her grip on her backpack and walked a little taller as they made their way to the car. This trip had started with excitement, turned into a challenge, and ended with a lesson she'd carry for a long time. Alana knew now that her place wasn't determined by others. It was determined by her own belief in her worth. A few weeks after their trip, Alana sat at the kitchen table, finishing her homework. The sun streamed through the window, and she felt much more relaxed than she had that day on the plane. The memory still stung a bit, but she noticed something different. She felt stronger. Her dad's calm confidence and the changes that followed had left an impression on her. Her father came into the kitchen, holding a cup of coffee. "How's the math coming along?" he asked with a smile. "Getting there," Alana said, grinning. "It's easier than dealing with that flight attendant." Jonathan chuckled. "True, but I think you handled that better than any math problem." Alana set her pencil down. "Did you hear back from the airline? Did they really make changes?" Jonathan nodded. "They did. They sent me a follow-up report. Brenda's undergoing extra training, and they've updated their staff policies. It won't fix what happened, but it's a step in the right direction." Alana was quiet for a moment, then said, "Do you think she really learned her lesson?" Jonathan took a sip of his coffee and then replied, "I hope so. Sometimes people just need to be shown how their actions affect others. If we can teach that, it's worth it." Alana smiled. "I think I learned something too." "Yeah, what's that?" Jonathan asked, sitting across from her. "I learned that it's important to stand up for myself," Alana said. And that even if someone treats me badly, I don't have to let it ruin everything. Jonathan nodded. Exactly. And you can also help others see things differently. That's how we make things better, little by little. Alana went back to her homework, feeling a sense of peace. It wasn't just about that one flight anymore. It was about how she carried herself going forward. She decided that no matter where she went, she'd remember her worth and never let anyone make her feel less than she was. As Jonathan watched his daughter work, he felt a surge of pride. Alana had been through something tough, but she'd come out stronger. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but he also knew she'd face them with confidence and resilience. Over the next few months, Alana and Jonathan took more trips together. Each time, they saw the same courteous, respectful service they had always expected. It was a sign that even small actions, like standing up for what's right, could make a big difference. Alana never forgot the lesson she learned that day. And as she grew older, she carried that experience with her, using it to help others and to remind herself that she belonged wherever she chose to be. It wasn't just about first class anymore. It was about knowing she deserved to be treated with dignity, no matter where life took her. Days passed, and the world continued to watch as the investigation into Officer Miller's actions unfolded. What had started as a single moment of injustice had grown into a nationwide movement, with people from all walks of life rallying for change. Tasha's story was everywhere, on the news, on social media, and in the hearts of those who had experienced similar hardships. The local police department was under intense scrutiny. Officer Miller's suspension had turned into an official investigation, and the truth of his history came to light. The complaints against him had been piling up for years, ignored by those who were supposed to protect the public. But now, with the world looking in, the department could no longer hide the truth. Marcus Williams, FBI chief and Tasha's father, had made sure that every detail was uncovered. He worked tirelessly, using the full weight of his position to ensure that justice would be served. The investigation revealed a troubling pattern of behavior from Miller, and other officers who had turned a blind eye to his actions were now being questioned. The department was forced to confront its flaws and admit that things needed to change. Tasha, though still shaken by the events, became a symbol of strength and resilience. She was invited to speak at rallies, on news programs, and at events where people gathered to demand fairness and equality. But despite the attention, she remained humble. Tasha knew this wasn't about her. It was about everyone who had ever been mistreated or overlooked. It was about making sure nothing like this happened again. The press conference her father had held was still fresh in people's minds. Marcus had called for sweeping reforms, changes in how officers were trained, more oversight, and a commitment to serving the community with respect. His words had struck a chord, and now, the local government was listening. The mayor and the governor, both of whom had initially been reluctant to act, were now on board with the necessary changes. They promised to take action, not just for Tasha, but for the future of their city. Back at the police station, things were changing too. Captain Harris, who had once defended Miller, now found himself in the difficult position of overseeing the department's reform efforts. He addressed his officers in a meeting, acknowledging that things needed to change. "We've been given a second chance," he said. "We need to be better. We need to be the kind of department this community deserves." Miller's fate was sealed. After the thorough investigation, it was clear that he would face consequences. He was fired from the department, and legal action was being taken against him. The town, once divided, was starting to heal. And though the scars of the past would remain, there was a sense that justice had been served. Tasha stood with her father as the crowds gathered outside the police station to celebrate the changes that were underway. People were cheering, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and accountability now. Tasha looked up at her father, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. She had never imagined that one small act of courage could lead to such a powerful change. For the first time in a long while, Tasha felt hope. The world had listened, and things were beginning to get better. The fight wasn't over, but it had made a difference. and Tasha knew, with her father by her side, they would keep fighting for justice, no matter the cost. Back at the police station, the air was thick with tension. Word of the incident had already spread, and officers exchanged nervous glances as Chief Marcus Hale walked into the briefing room. His calm demeanor betrayed none of the frustration simmering beneath the surface. Officer Carter followed behind, his head slightly bowed, aware that all eyes were on him. Marcus turned to face the room, his gaze steady as he addressed the assembled officers. "I want to make one thing clear," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "What happened today was unacceptable, not just for me, but for this department and the community we serve." The room was silent. Even Carter didn't dare to speak. He stood off to the side, his arms crossed, looking uncomfortable but unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. Marcus continued, his tone firm but not unkind. "We are here to protect and serve all people, regardless of their background, appearance, or circumstances. That means following proper procedures and acting with respect, professionalism, and fairness." Ramirez and Jenkins, seated near the front, nodded in agreement. Other officers shifted in their seats, some looking thoughtful, others avoiding eye contact. It was clear that Marcus's words were hitting home. Turning his attention directly to Carter, Marcus spoke evenly. "Officer Carter, you made a series of poor decisions today. You allowed your assumptions to guide your actions instead of following protocol. You failed to verify my identity properly and escalated a situation that could have been resolved with a simple call to dispatch." Carter's face reddened as he finally looked up. "Chief, I was only trying to protect." He started, but Marcus raised a hand to stop him. "This is not about intentions, Officer Carter," Marcus said firmly. "It's about accountability. Every officer in this room has a responsibility to uphold the values of this department. When we fail to do that, we lose the trust of the community." The room remained silent, the gravity of Marcus's words sinking in. Even those who had initially dismissed him as the new guy couldn't deny the truth of what he was saying. "Today's incident is being reviewed by the Internal Affairs Department," Marcus continued. "We will address what happened fairly and transparently. In the meantime, Officer Carter, you are placed on administrative leave effective immediately. You will be required to attend additional training sessions to ensure this does not happen again." Carter opened his mouth as if to protest, but then closed it again, realizing there was nothing he could say to defend himself. He nodded stiffly, muttering, "Yes, Chief." Marcus took a deep breath, scanning the room. "This is not just about one incident," he said, addressing everyone. "This is about creating a culture of accountability, respect, and integrity. I expect all of you to reflect on what happened today and strive to do better." The officers nodded, some more reluctantly than others. Marcus's words hung in the air as the meeting concluded, marking the beginning of a new chapter for the department and for Officer Carter.